Right. I teach U.S. history actually at American International College in Springfield, and it's a small school, private, co-ed, usual range of undergraduate programs. Increasingly it's adding some graduate programs, but we only have about 1,500 undergraduates, about the same number of graduate students actually, and the classes are smaller than some of those that have been talked about here. I think the ratio for faculty to students at AIC is like 14 or 15 to 1. I teach, and the college is interesting though because it's a small private college, but the student body, I would say, is middle class, and I would say working class and sometimes poor, rather than sort of upper middle class. It's also very diverse, and I see these as strengths, not weaknesses. Very diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, African Americans and Hispanics. So that's where I teach U.S. history. With regards to sort of American history today, historians have always, history has changed over time, divided the past into eras. So some of the lower level courses, some of the courses I teach are chronologically defined, going all the way from, I'm very much a generalist, you have to be at a small teaching college, 4-4 load. US historians, have addressed certain themes as well, and the themes maybe have changed more than the periods over time. Currently, the subject of, for example, the history of capitalism in America is a hot topic. Religion is, frontiers, borderlands, and the West is, African American history, Indian history. A very hot area is the US in the world. The US is positioned in sort of, global, the world. And the approach of historians, more or less, has changed over time. There's always been a focus, in a sense, as there should be, on elites, the political and economic elites, diplomatic, military elites. But increasingly, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there's been a focus on non-elites, other social groups as well, and how those, the elite and the non-elite, by non-elite I mean Native Americans, women, slaves, workers, interact. So as I say, I teach 4-4 at AIC, usually a combination of lower level and upper level courses, the 2 sections of the US History Survey, to be explicit, and 2 upper level courses. The upper level courses are either chronologically or thematically defined. And now with regards to the survey, talking about sort of being in the trenches and teaching the survey, each semester I teach 2 sections of the US History Survey. In the fall it would be 1877, in the spring it would be since 1877. My classes are relatively small compared to yours though. I have about 25 students in each course, in actual fact, each section. With the upper level courses, I teach 2 of those, chronologically, say, defined. Enrollment seems to be better for modern American history than early American history, and especially recent American history. So I teach some upper level chronological courses, but also thematic courses. In the this year, for example, in the fall, I taught American sports history for the first time. This spring I taught African American history for the second time. Funnily enough, AIC has a very large percentage of African American students, and sadly I think that was only the second time that course had been offered in like 25 years. And I've also taught immigration and ethnicity at American International College as well. Now with regards to assigning the course content for the surveys, it's almost like an unthinking decision sometimes what texts to assign. I have used in the past Gary B. Nash, The American People, Creating a Nation and Society, and the accompanying book of documents, which is Voices of the American People. Some of you may remember Gary B. Nash, if you think back to the 1990s and think back to Lynn Cheney, and the voluntary standards which were created for the teaching of history in American high schools. Gary B. Nash and Lynn Cheney oversaw that project. If you remember, it was a crucial part of the cultural wars of that time. I was just saying to Neil, in actual fact, Gary B. Nash, who is a wonderful American historian, because I think I'm correct in saying this, I don't mean to exaggerate, because of some of literally the politics associated with that, subsequently had a heart attack. And it may have had something to do with the stress and tension of the politics involved in putting together those voluntary standards for the teaching of US history. And the ironic thing is they're not militant or radical at all. They really reflect the work of a generation of US historians. But not to get off topic. So I use Gary B. Nash, The American People, Creating a Nation and Society. I particularly like his focus and emphasis. He sort of explicitly or implicitly, the theme of the textbook is sort of history for a democratic society. That was actually a title of an article he wrote as well. History for a Democratic Society, the work of all the people. And he focuses very much on the elites, but also the non-elites, other social groups, and their role in history. It's quite appropriate. Here we are, in Boston, Massachusetts. This isn't the Payne Room, is it? This is Stone Room. He, for example, with the American Revolution, I'm just trying to explain why I like this text. He focuses very much, for example, in the story of the Revolution, on not the elite but the lower orders, and as we're here in Boston, a figure called Ebenezer McIntosh, right, who is this poor shoemaker from Boston who played a key role in the Stamp Act crisis, and the resistance to the Stamp Act. And the example he uses for modern American history, which I'm sure you'll all be more familiar with, is Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. So this is how he tries to convey the role of ordinary people in American history and the important role they have taken in American history and can play again in the future. So he sees sort of history as very much relevant to the individual, the human being, and the citizen, especially in a democratic society. So that's my thinking. That's one of the reasons why I've stuck with that textbook for so long. To be perfectly frank, I might soon switch, and I might switch to a textbook written by Eric Foner called Give Me Liberty, An American History, which my colleagues seem to think very, very highly of and are assigning in increasing numbers. So I've traditionally used Gary B. Nash. I might switch to Eric Foner. And the course itself, I divide it in the US History Survey. I don't try to be sort of super creative. I try to convey the most important historical eras as historians have seen them, from the past to the present. Try to convey the big themes or issues, some of the important questions historians have asked, and continue try to answer. And they read the text, hopefully. That's what the pop quizzes are for, reading quizzes. And I use a book of documents as well, Voices of the American People, which actually is not, I don't think is quite as good as the actual text itself, but it's got a lot of great documents in it. So they have quizzes, reading quizzes, tests, exams. I always include an essay on the exams, encourage them or require them to incorporate knowledge from class, their readings and the documents as well into their answers. I try to convey Nash's central sort of thrust, which is the role of ordinary people in history, which isn't always obvious to the students in actual fact. One of the examples I used for the students at the beginning of this semester, which wasn't didn't come out of my reading of Nash's textbook, but reading of another recent book about the March on Washington from '63 was what were the origins of the March on Washington? And normally, I guess, most of the public or students would think, well, you know, Kennedy, Johnson, the Supreme Court, you know, King maybe, you know, Rosa Parks. But according to a recent book by someone called William P. Jones, of course, Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph were also important. And where did Randolph get the idea for a March on Washington? Well, he had it in the 1940s during World War II, actually before America entered the war. But as my grandfather used to say, Americans are always 2 years late for every war, right? 1914, 1917, 1939, 1945. Now we get there before everyone else, right? Now we're first, right? But anyway, and I was reading this book by William P. Jones, and this is the theme I do try to convey to the students, not to exaggerate it, but to make them consider it, and that is that Randolph was organized a March on Washington movement so that African Americans would have equal access to jobs in the war industries, which were industries which would be crucial to the war effort, which were reviving, and desegregate the armed forces. Now, he didn't get that, but he did get the Fair Employment Practices Commission. But anyway, where did Randolph get that idea, right? It was in a public meeting in Chicago, right? A meeting of African Americans in Chicago, and an anonymous African American woman, we don't know her name, raised her hand and said, let's have a march on Washington with 100,000 Negroes going to Washington, right? Which I think is a great, fabulous example of the role of ordinary people in history. She should get a Congressional Medal of Honor, right? But anyway, this is why I like Gary B. Nash and this sort of approach. With regards to upper level classes, as I said, I've taught African American history recently, immigration and ethnicity, sports history, not so much my favorite, but the students liked it, But one of the courses I like to teach, in actual fact, again, this might be appropriate as we're in Boston, as we're in Massachusetts, right, is I teach a course on American radicalism, meaning sort of the struggle for not freedom, but also equality. That equality is the core value and goal of American radical movements from the revolution to the present. And that's not a course that's commonly offered. Maybe more so in the last decade and a half, but not commonly offered. It's not sort of a course as commonly offered as, say, African American history or immigration and ethnicity or Native American history, something like that. And it really comes out of, in actual fact, I guess a relatively long line of historians. For example, Eric Foner taught that course, The American Radical Tradition. He's going to retire soon, at Columbia for many years. He taught it as an upper-level course using largely secondary sources. If you go back before him, of course, here we are in Boston, Howard Zinn. If you went back to before Zinn, there would be Sidney Lenz, for example, and you could trace the sort of lineage of Sidney Lenz actually published a book, Radicalism in American History. Trace the sort of lineage of the course back. I've offered it as an upper level, but I use primary sources rather than secondary sources for various reasons, in actual fact. One might be the cost of a lot of monographs written by scholars, published by university presses or scholarly presses. But more seriously, because I'd like students to read the historical documents, the primary sources themselves, complete and unabridged rather than excerpts, right? Ideally. So, for example, as you can tell, I have a lot of fun with this class. I have a lot of fun when I teach anyway, But with the radicalism class, it's great. You can literally go from Common Sense, David Walker's Appeal, The Jungle, the Declaration of Sentiments, Solitude of Self, Martin Luther King's writings and speeches, Malcolm X speaks, the feminine mystique. There's just a wealth of great material. And I prefer if the students would rent or buy the discrete texts. More recently, I've switched to assigning an anthology, which is The Radical Reader, published by the New Press. First edition was about 10 years ago, edited by Timothy Patrick McCarthy, who actually teaches at the Kennedy School of Government. As he puts it, he goes from, how does he say? He says he goes from Tom Paine to Tupac Shakur, right, in terms of American radicalism. I've assigned that reader. And then what I do, although I prefer to have them read the complete unabridged texts, and then what they do is when the students for that course, when they do papers, I have them select either a famous, and I encourage them to select something not quite so famous, more obscure, sort of text from the history of American radicalism, and to analyse that text. Now it's at that point that so I've sort of encouraged the students to use digital resources, to use either in the selection of a radical work to analyse, and put in the context of American radicalism generally, its nature and its significance, right? So I encourage them to use the web, look at websites, be critical about the website, and the documents offered, and to use the library and use the databases to access, scholarly articles and journals. And if, use the library to use monographs that are contained in the library or available through interlibrary loan. I like to get familiarise students with the use of articles in print or scholarly articles in print or full text available through a database, particularly as well, because I don't mean to be down on scholarly presses and university presses, quite the contrary in actual fact, right? But I know they can be expensive, but the other thing is with undergraduates as well, I found that in terms of a scholarly monograph, for many times, not that they're not wonderful, right, and the fruit of years of labour and research, and we all know what that involves, but very often you can get, what's the new evidence, or what's the sort of new contribution in terms of argument or interpretation, that can be conveyed in a much shorter article. And that might be available through a database. So I encourage students, this is talking in depth about this history of radicalism course that I teach, but I as I say, sometimes I'll assign discrete individual texts, sometimes an anthology, and encourage them to utilize websites and the articles available in databases. So thus far I've tended to, I think I don't have an exact, as you say, replicable process for selecting course content. It just changes gradually over time, and I try to select what I think is most appropriate at that time. I'm actually going to teach the radicalism course in the fall, and I haven't actually assigned the readings yet. And I could assign, say, half a dozen texts, or use an anthology, a recent anthology actually, maybe The Radical Reader, maybe a different one. But sometimes I think using anthologies, it's good because of accessibility and cost and affordability, but it sort of ties you in a way to using as much of the content of the anthology as possible. And students tend to feel, well, we skipped this and this chapter, why did I have to buy the book? And the anthology sometimes can sort of, in a way, restrict what you can use. For example, one of the movements I always cover is American communism, right, from the 30s to the 50s. And talking about how we select texts, there was a famous or infamous American communist, Howard Stretch Johnson. I don't know if anyone's ever seen that old documentary, Seeing Red, Stories of American Communists, and he's featured in that. And and an African American. And he passed away about 10 years ago, but he wrote his autobiography, and his daughter has just sort of edited it, and it's been published by Fordham University Press. I'm just waiting for my copy to arrive to read it, actually. I'd love to write a review of it. But I'd love to take the chapter where he deals about the 30s from his autobiography, and maybe pair it with a couple of chapters from Mark Nason's book on communists in Harlem in the 30s and 40s, and use that when we get to the Great Depression, a New Deal. I guess, I don't have a replicable, as I say, I'm repeating myself, method for assigning course content, but affordability is important, accessibility is important. With the accessibility, with regards to print, one of my worries is, would I have to sort of run interference with tech problems? And, or would IT sort of step into that role, whereas print is easily accessible. But I think the most important thing for me is not, is it print or is it digital? Is it appropriate reading? Is it affordable? Is it accessible? Because reading is the primary gateway to knowledge. I guess I'm preaching to the converted. We all believe knowledge is important. One of my I'll finish with this actually, I don't want to run over, but one of my favourite historians recently passed away actually, Eric Hobsbawm from Britain. And he was teaching a class at the New School in New York City in the 1990s, and I think it was the class or the lecture dealt with World War II, and someone from the audience afterwards raised their hand and said, well, you talk about World War II, that implies there was a World War I. I just mean about, how important knowledge is, and we can't, reading is the primary way to get at it, print or digital, and you can't assume anything. I mean, Eric Hobsbawm at the New School, and someone raises their hand and says, and World War II implies there was a World War I. Anyway, I'll stop there. All right.
Our last speaker is Franny.
Sure. I had to sit by myself the whole panel. I feel like I'm part of the group now.
As you're a lawyer, I don't violate it. If I photocopy it, I won't violate it.
Bill, Heather, and I had coordinated a similar